Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, presented by Rhea Mishra. Jane Austen began her second novel, Pride and Prejudice, before she was 21. It was originally titled First Impression. Later, she renamed it to Pride and Prejudice. Austen was writing in the time period called the Regency. England was at war in America on one side, and Napoleon was rampaging through Europe on the other side. Austen was critical of the social barrier between middle and upper class that existed at the time and uses that as a plot in her story. The characters in the story are the Bennets, Elizabeth Bennet, the heroine, the Bingleys, Mr. Darcy, who was the hero, Mr. Collins, Lady Catherine, Charlotte Lucas, and Mr. Wickham. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet live in the country with their 5 unmarried daughters. The 2 eldest Bennet daughters are Jane and Elizabeth. Mr. Collins, a cousin, will inherit Mr. Bennet's estate when Mr. Bennet dies. If this happens, Mrs. Bennet worries that her daughters will not have a place to live unless they marry rich husbands. Mr. Bingley, a rich young bachelor, rents a house near the Bennet family. Mr. Bingley likes Jane. Mr. Darcy, a handsome, rich, and proud man, is Bingley's friend. The Bennet sisters are introduced to George Wickham, a handsome and charming military officer. Wickham lies to Elizabeth about how Mr. Darcy was mean to him. Elizabeth is convinced that Mr. Darcy is indeed evil. Mr. Darcy does not like Elizabeth initially, but later begins to like Elizabeth's intelligence. Mr. Collins proposes to Elizabeth. She refuses his offer, which makes her mother, Mrs. Bennet, upset and angry. Offended, Mr. Collins marries Charlotte Lucas, Elizabeth's best friend. Mr. Bingley goes back to London without offering marriage to Jane. Elizabeth goes to visit her friend Charlotte. During her visit, she is invited to dine at the residence of Lady Catherine, where she meets Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth learns Mr. Darcy was responsible for separating Bingley and Jane. She's mad at Mr. Darcy, and later, when Mr. Darcy proposes to her, she refuses him. She accuses him of his treatment of Wickham and for breaking her sister's heart. Mr. Darcy leaves after writing a letter to defend him. He revealed Wickham's true character. Wickham had tried to run away with Darcy's sister to gain her fortune. Upon reading the letter, Elizabeth starts to forgive Darcy. Elizabeth returns home to their family. Elizabeth visits Darcy's estate with her aunt and Uncle Gardiner. Darcy stumbles upon Elizabeth and is nice to Elizabeth and the Gardiners. Elizabeth is astonished at the drastic change in his character. Elizabeth receives news from Jane that Lydia, her younger sister, has run away with Mr. Wickham. She tells Mr. Darcy the horrible news before she returns home. Lydia marries Wickham. Elizabeth finds out that Mr. Darcy was responsible for finding Wickham and making him marry Lydia. Elizabeth has new respect for Darcy. Soon Mr. Bingley returns from London and proposes to Jane. Lady Catherine visits Elizabeth and wants her to promise that she will never marry Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth refuses to make such a promise. Mr. Darcy learns of Elizabeth's response to Lady Catherine. He proposes to Elizabeth and they become engaged. Elizabeth and Darcy are married along with Jane and Bingley. What I learned from this story is that we shouldn't judge people by their appearances. Thank you for watching my video and have a great day.